There is a reward that we can see in the brains of people when they see someone suffer if that person is first portrayed as a wrongdoer. So ordinarily, if you see someone be shocked, you have anterior insula. It's like you're being shocked too. Unless that person is first portrayed as violating some moral or social norm, in which case, dopamine, you get a reward out of seeing that person punished. I think that it is a lust just as much as lust for substances or lust for sexual partners. It is a desire people want to see people punished.
I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Catherine Page Hardin. She is a psychologist and geneticist and a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Hardin is an expert in how our genes shape our life trajectory, especially how they interact with life events during our adolescence and how they impact our long-term mental and physical health. Today, we discuss the interplay of nature and nurture in addiction, criminality, susceptibility to trauma, and the larger themes of sin, sociopathy, empathy, and forgiveness. As you'll soon see, Dr. Hardin is unique in her ability to define how biology, psychology, and the sometimes randomness of life interact to drive people's choices. Today, we talk about known differences between males and females, the role of hormones and hormone-independent influences on male-female differences, and how people assume different roles in life depending on the power structures they find themselves in. I want to be very clear that this is not a tap dance around the big issues episode. Today, you are going to hear a very direct conversation about what the best science says about the role of genes and environment on human choice, and how the biology, meaning genes and everything downstream of them, neurotransmitters, hormones, etc., drive what choices are available to people and which ones they tend to make. I've long been a fan of Dr. Catherine Page Hardin's work because I know of no one else researching these topics with the level of rigor that she is. And as you'll soon hear, she is an exceptional educator. She's clear, she's direct to the question, and her compassion and belief in people's ability to better themselves no matter what their genes are and to better the world is woven into everything she says. And it's all backed by data. I should also mention that I learned during today's episode that Dr. Catherine Page Hardin has a new book coming out soon. It is entitled Original Sin: On the Genetics of Vice, the Problems with Blame, and the Future of Forgiveness. And you can find that anywhere books are sold. It's now available for pre-sale. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, today's episode does include sponsors. And now for my discussion with Dr. Catherine Page Hardin. Dr. Catherine Page Hardin, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Few things are as interesting to people as the relationship between genes and behavior, or what we call genotype and phenotype, the expression of all the stuff downstream of genes. And few things are as interesting as adolescence and puberty and the home we grew up in and how our genes interact with our choices, etc. You work at the intersection of all of those, which is a very brave thing to do. Could you just frame for us why you selected to study the relationship between genes and outcomes using adolescence as the time point in which you jump off from those questions? Because it could have been, from infancy or in old age. Why adolescence?
Yeah, so I did my PhD at the University of Virginia, and I was trained as a clinical psychologist. And if you're looking at when does mental illness emerge, when does this risk for mental illness really start to increase, it's in adolescence. So most cases of substance use disorders or addiction begin in adolescence. That's when people's risk for depression goes up. If you're going to have a first psychotic episode, that's going to be in late adolescence, early adulthood. So from a clinical perspective, adolescence is really interesting. And then I'm also was trained as a lifespan developmental psychologist. So thinking about how does what's happening early in the life reverberate really through the rest of your lifespan. And if you think about when in life do individual differences between people emerge, canalize, get deeper, when are people's life trajectories really starting to be apparent? It's in adolescence. So I came into this field really interested in teenagers, late childhood and the teenage years. So thinking about puberty, sexual behavior. But then from there, what's happening in adolescence? It's also rule breaking or aggression or, again, risk for alcohol and drug use. So my research program was really based on, okay, well, what's happening in this period of life where the genes we're born with and the family environments we were raised with, how do they combine to shape people's lives? By the time people finish their teenage years, they begin adulthood. They're beginning adulthood on such different life trajectories.
what ages constitute adolescence?
I mean, that's changing, I think, right now. We typically think of adolescence as beginning with the physical changes of puberty, right? Adolescence is this period of transition to reproductive and social maturity. So we're thinking of adolescence as beginning between 10 and 13 when people are going through puberty. I think more controversial is when does adolescence end? Because historically, we've defined that as you're an adult when you take on the social roles of adulthood. And that keeps being, for various reasons, economic, social reasons, pushed back later and later. So I've typically studied people between 10 and 25, so that kind of 15-year period. A 10-year-old is clearly a child. A 25-year-old is about to be kicked off their parents' insurance. They can finally run a car. They can technically take on the social roles of adulthood. And that's a long period of time where a lot of things are happening in the body and the brain.
This may be outside the scope of what you work on, but I've always been struck by the fact that while kids, including myself, generally hit puberty somewhere, as you said, between 10 and 13 or maybe 14. Some seem to go through puberty for a much longer period of time. And I think of puberty as perhaps one of the biggest developmental milestones because the brain changes, hormones change, of course, but perceptually and how people perceive you changes completely. And the acquisition of what we know as secondary sex characteristics seems to occur at such different rates. So, I mean, I can be open about this. I know I hit puberty at 14, but then I didn't really shave until I was almost graduating college.
Yeah.
But I had grown, right? Whereas there were other kids that we went home for the summer
and they came
back like not a grown man, but looking like this guy's
like a grown man.
Yeah. And kicking our butts in soccer. And he's just, just in terms of everything, right? But then, and I don't want to out this person, but then when I look at us now, it seems that the people that went through puberty more quickly may have aged more quickly in general. Is there any notion of a clock and the rate of that clock turning can be sort of visualized in puberty and predict longevity? Is there any relationship there?
We are working on this right now. So we can think about individual differences in puberty in three ways. We can think about pubertal timing. So when does it start? For girls, early pubertal timing seems to be the best predictor of risk for mental health problems, physical health problems, earlier menopause, shorter lifespan.
Early onset of puberty.
So it's
not looking at the sort of rate of characteristics.
Yeah. For boys, it seems that the difference in pubertal pace or some people call it pubertal tempo. So not just how early does it start, but how long does it take for all of those changes to unfold? We did a study many years ago where we found that boys were less affected by when it started, but more affected, at least for their emotional development, by how quickly it happened. With boys, where they changed overnight, having the hardest time sort of assimilating all these changes that are happening because your cognition is not necessarily maturing as quickly as your height or your musculature or your hormones. And so it seemed that boys seem to be particularly sensitive to going through puberty very, very quickly. What we've been looking at recently is how the epigenome changes during this period of time. So the genome is your DNA. It's the DNA sequence in your cells, and that doesn't change with development. But the epigenome is everything on top of the genome that affects how DNA is used by the body, used by the cells. And there's one epigenetic mechanism known as DNA methylation, which is, a methyl group is basically like this chemical tag, and it can get kind of tagged onto the genome. So there's great work in aging that shows that the epigenetic clock measured by DNA methylation starts ticking in infancy, and faster biological aging as measured by the epigenome predicts shorter lifespan, worse health, earlier mortality. What we looked at is, instead of training an epigenetic clock on age, can we train it on pubertal development? So how physically mature you are. And what we found is you can. So there's the clock is ticking as you get older, but there's another clock that's also ticking as you become more physically mature. And those two things are correlated. So the epigenetic changes that we see as you go through puberty faster do seem to be related to aging more rapidly even in older life. So Our reproductive development is, I think, very tied at a cellular, molecular level with our lifespan development. And we see this across species. If you genetically engineer mice to go through puberty earlier, they die earlier. So we have this trade-off between reproductive maturity and lifespan across species, within species. And I think now we're beginning to see that at the molecular level too.
Fascinating. I also like the way that answer lands because I had a very protracted puberty.
Yeah.
And I feel grateful for that.
Yeah.
In retrospect, because, in terms of athletic ability and things like that, I wasn't really delayed, but I also couldn't get past the sort of middle of the distribution. But then over time, it's like, this is kind of wild. I feel like I look very different.
Mm-hmm.
I looked very different at 30 than I did at 20, like markedly different without doing anything except existing. Some people seem kind of frozen in their adult look at this earlier age. And from the animal literature, and I'm thinking the studies from my colleague Eric Knudsen in particular, where he was looking at plasticity in barn owls, but it's been looked at elsewhere. There's this really striking correlation between the onset of puberty and the end of the so-called critical period for neuroplasticity. Of course, plasticity can go on throughout the lifespan, but the plasticity that occurs until and around puberty is an order of magnitude greater than the plasticity that's available as, say, a 30-year-old or 40-year-old. So they've done the experiments of like overreactomizing animals or taking the testicles out of animals and somewhat preventing puberty. And it doesn't seem to extend that window. So in humans, is there any relationship between cognition, brain flexibility, and the onset of puberty, the timing of the onset of puberty?
That's a really interesting question. And it's complicated. In part because it's like, well, what part of plasticity are you looking at? What part of brain development are you looking at? And also, with humans, we can't, unlike animals, manipulate the onset of puberty in quite the same way. So it does seem like there are some cognitive functions, like if you're thinking about executive function ability, your ability to shift attention or update, the things that are tested by a standard IQ test, those seem to be much more age-related, whereas your ability to learn from peers versus your parents, your sensitivity to risk and certain types of emotions, that seems to be more tied to pubertal development than with age. But they're so confounded within observational studies in humans that it's a continuing challenge to try to pull these apart.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers professional therapy with the licensed therapist carried out entirely online. I've been doing therapy for a very long time, and I can tell you that it's a lot like physical workouts. There are days when I want to do it, and there are days when I don't want to do it. But when I finish a therapy session, every single time, I come away feeling better and knowing that the time was well spent. And typically when I finish therapy, I come away with a valuable insight or new perspective on something I'm working through, whether that's with work, with relationships, in my personal life, or simply in my relationship with myself. There's just so much benefit that comes through effective therapy. With BetterHelp, they make it very easy to find an expert therapist who can help provide the benefits that come from effective therapy. They have a short questionnaire to help you match to a therapist that's right for you. And while BetterHelp has an industry-leading match rate, if you aren't happy with your match, you can switch to a different therapist at any time. Also, because BetterHelp is done entirely online, it's extremely time efficient. There's no driving to a therapist's office, looking for parking, etc. If you'd like to try BetterHelp, go to betterhelp.com/Huberman to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Lingo. Lingo helps you track your glucose to support better metabolic health, mental clarity, and sustained energy. Glucose directly impacts our brain function, mood, and energy levels, and it may even affect our levels of tenacity and willpower. This is why I use the continuous glucose monitor from Lingo. I absolutely love it, and I'm thrilled to have them as a sponsor of the podcast. Lingo helps me track my glucose in real time to see how the foods I eat and the actions I take impact my glucose. When glucose in your body spikes or crashes, your cognitive and physical performance do too. In fact, large glucose peaks and valleys lead to brain fog, fatigue, irritability, and hunger. What you eat, of course, plays a major role in your glucose. Some foods cause sharp spikes and big crashes, and others do not. But not everyone is the same in terms of how they respond to particular foods. Seeing your glucose in real time helps you build eating and other habits that support metabolic health, mental clarity, and sustained energy. Lingo has helped me to better understand what foods to eat, when to eat, and how things like a brief walk after a meal can help keep my glucose stable, and much more. If you'd like to try Lingo, Lingo is offering Huberman podcast listeners in the US 10% off a 4-week Lingo plan. Terms and conditions apply. Visit hellolingo.com/Huberman for more information. The Lingo glucose system is for users 18 and older, not on insulin. It is not intended for the diagnosis of diseases, including diabetes. Individual responses may vary. I recall some mouse data showing that if you expose young pre-pubescent mice to older males, they enter puberty earlier. Does that exist in humans as well?
So this is a controversial area of research. It is true that human girls who are raised with a non-biological father do on average tend to go through puberty earlier. And some have hypothesized that it's a similar sort of cue from the environment about the stability and availability of resources. If dad is gone, maybe the provisioning of the environment is going to be less stable. Maybe evolution would favor a reproductive strategy where you go through puberty earlier rather than this continued, childhood is so costly, right? Like a human childhood is long. It takes a lot. I have 3 kids. It takes a lot to feed them, to grow an adult. And so it might make sense to say, okay, well, if resources are going to be scarce or if resources are going to be unpredictable, it might be better for me to have this strategy where I go through puberty earlier. What's difficult about that is that people don't end up in family structures at random. And moms who go through puberty are more likely to have sex at younger ages, more likely to end up in non-marital childbearing family structures, and are likely to have daughters who are being raised without a biological father. So is it the biological father absence that's causing the earlier puberty? Or is it that mom has genes that predispose her towards early puberty? That changes her reproductive life, and then she's more likely to be in this certain family structure and pass on those genes to her daughters. It seems to be a little bit of both, which is kind of the standard answer to all of our questions about nature and nurture, that there's a very strong genetic effect on the timing of puberty for both boys and girls, but that also the environment is pushing it in different directions. And that's part of why we're seeing that the age of puberty keeps going down with every successive cohort. I mean, it's been falling for basically as long as we've been keeping data, people have been going through puberty earlier.
I'm realizing that you have a very, very difficult job because the languaging is so delicate.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to jump on the bed of nails for you.
Okay.
I've also heard that if the biological father is present, it provides a quote unquote protective effect against this earlier onset of puberty in the presence of the non-biological father. But just that language, protective effect, implies that a 1-year shift or 2-year shift earlier puberty is somehow bad. Like I think the human brain just works this way, right? For understandable reasons, like, these young girls that were supposed to go into puberty at 14, they're now going to puberty at 10 because the dad was absent. They
pathologize it.
They pathologize it and they write a script. And then, as you point out, there's things related to the situation as it relates to the mother and her choices and her genes. And it's a real barbed wire mess for the typical person to try and pull apart. You're pulling these things apart beautifully, but it's also fodder for anyone that wants to drive a narrative. That's tough. How do you navigate that? Because I'm going to ask you about adolescence and genes and sexual promiscuity, right? We're talking about today. We're going to talk about sin. And so how do you look at these things? I know you look at them objectively, but then how does one choose to communicate about these things in a way that doesn't arm people to kind of run their own agendas, whether they realize it or not?
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm the best person to give advice about that. I'm a scientist. I'm a mother. I'm a college professor. I teach intro psych at UT. And so I'm always thinking about, what does the science say? How would I explain this to my 13-year-old? How would I explain this to my undergrads? And with a sense of awe and respect for how amazing a human body and brain is, right? Like to think about, we as women, as at one time girls, are equipped with a brain that's, looking out into the environment and integrating all of these signals about internal and external, about, resources and stress and body weight and light, and integrating that to say, okay, now's the best time for us in our situation to go. Now is the time for our bodies to change in these amazing ways. That is puberty. I feel like I keep coming back to, if we have respect for the amazingness of the human body and the brain, and I'm trying to communicate it with clarity and empathy in the way that my 13-year-old son would understand it. I don't always succeed at that goal, but that's really I feel like that as an educator, that's how I'm approaching these topics.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I didn't ask that to kind of inoculate against anything. But now we can really get into the
now
the
you
tangle.
Can let her rip.
Yeah. I have long thought that the hypothalamus, right, these various clusters of neurons above the roof of our mouth that drive hunger and sex behavior and thirst and aggression and a bunch of other interesting things, is sort of the seat of the 7 deadly sins.
I've heard you say this before.
Yeah. And of course, all those brain circuits and structures interact with other brain circuits and structures. That's there's no one location in the brain that governs a behavior entirely, with some rare exceptions. How do you think about the genetic programming of the hypothalamus in terms of people's proclivity for addiction, promiscuity, aggression, being overly passive in a way that might harm them or other people as well?
I don't really think that much about the hypothalamus per se, actually, in relation to those behaviors. So just stepping back one step, when you made this reference to the 7 deadly sins, right? So if I kind of remember all of them, there's wrath, there's envy, there's lust, there's greed, there's sloth. And what do the 7 deadly sins have in common? How can we operationalize that more scientifically? What those behaviors all have in common is, except envy for a second, is doing something that might be pleasurable in the short term, to the extent that there's negative consequences to yourself or negative consequences to other people. I think envy is interesting because you're seeing other people enjoying pleasures and you're like, I want that one, right? So it's kind of looking at other people's pursuit of things.
I think of envy as a severe opportunity cost, because as long as you're envying what someone else has or is doing, then you're missing all the stuff that's happening now that you could build your life on.
I think of envy as like a clue to what do you desire that you haven't admitted to yourself. One question I ask graduate students when I'm recruiting them is, whose career do you want? Whose career do you envy? Because that tells me more about where they really want to go with their lives than, their kind of prepared speech that they have for me.
Great question.
Yeah. Let's take wrath or let's take lust. Anger is an emotion that's useful. Sexual desire is an emotion that's useful. When do they become sins? They become sins in our minds when people are engaging that behavior in situations where we think it's going to be harmful, not just to themselves, but to other people. From a clinical psychology perspective, we would never say we're going to study the 7 deadly sins, but we do have clinical language or diagnoses where the predominant symptoms that you see are people engaging in behaviors that are impulsive, that are maybe immediately pleasurable, but in the long term harmful to themselves or other people. So the obvious constellation of this is substance use disorders, right? So it's I'm ingesting a substance, it feels good, and I'm doing that at significant cost to myself and other people. We can also think about in childhood what would be called conduct disorder, which are people who are children who are engaging in wrath. They're engaging in aggression towards other people that hurts other people, their parents, their teachers, their schools. The law is mad at them and they're doing it anyways. So what we're interested in scientifically is, are there genes that affect the likelihood of developing these disorders? Yes. Are there genetic overlaps between these different things? So do the genes that are the genes that make it more likely for you to become addicted to substances also make you more likely to have many sexual partners, also make you more likely to engage in impulsive aggression? That also appears to be the question, yes. And then if we're looking at genes that have these associations, not just with substances or not just with sexual behavior or not just with aggression, but have cross-cutting effects on all of them, what are they? Like, what are those genes? Where are they active in the brain? When are they expressed in development? So that's work that our group has been doing for 8 years now to try to discover what these genes. We have a good idea from twin and adoption studies that there are genetic influences on these things. And now we want to figure out what are they and where are they active in the brain? And it turns out that it's not just hypothalamus, it's really broadly distributed, throughout your brain.
I'll update my messaging. And I did couch it as a hypothesis. I never said that there were, that you could lesion one of the sins there are genes that vary between individuals
Yes.
that predict addiction, predict impulsivity, and other things.
Yeah.
You're exploring how the genes that predict addiction might predict impulsivity for other types of behaviors.
Yes.
I think I heard that the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Indeed, there's overlap.
Yeah.
So I'd be very curious to know what those genes encode for. What are the protein systems and neural circuit systems, hormone systems downstream of those genes?
Yeah. If we go back one step, just why did we think that there were going to be genes that overlap between this? The biggest set of results that supported this hypothesis were adoption and pedigree studies. So these big data registries, you get them in Sweden, you get them in the Scandinavian countries that keep track of every single one of their citizens. And what you see is that the 7 deadly sins run in families. So if you have an adoptive parent who's addicted to alcohol, you are more likely to have many sexual partners, and you're also more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder or be arrested for a violent crime. Even if you were never raised by that parent, and it's not just substance use to substance use or violence to violence or risky sexual behavior to risky sexual behavior, it seems that having a family history of any of these things increases your likelihood of manifesting any one of them. So that's why we thought that there was this genetic commonality across them. So what we found is that there's many, many, many genes that affect all of these behaviors. It's massively what we call polygenic. So it's not just one thing in one part of your genome. It's distributed throughout your genome. And that those genes are most expressed in neurodevelopment in utero, in second and third trimester. So if you look at genes that are associated with all of these things and you see, okay, when in the human lifespan are they most active? They're active during cortical development in the second and third trimester. So there's something very early neurodevelopmental that's going on them. And it seems to be affecting the brain's balance of inhibition and excitation. So as your brain is developing while you're in utero, the GABA system, which is inhibitory, and the glutamate system, which is excitatory, sort of being tuned, and the balance between those two things is being worked out. If children are born preterm, part of the reason that affects their psychological development negatively is because it affects this balance between inhibition and excitation. So I think we're still very at the beginning of this, understanding the bioannotation of it, the biological mechanisms of it. But what it suggests to us is that, sometimes you hear ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. I think that substance use disorders are every bit as a neurodevelopmental disorder as ADHD. I think conduct disorder, which is characterized by impulsive aggression, is every bit a neurodevelopmental disorder as ADHD. Because if you look at the genes that are causing them, they seem to be affecting this pattern of brain development very, very early in life, and this balance between the brain's inhibition and excitation.
Fascinating. I mean, I have to be careful not to go down this rabbit hole, but I started off as a developmental neurobiologist. Fetal brain wiring is,
we've
never really talked about it on this podcast, but we've talked about the effect of fetal exposure to hormones in the brain in particular, in terms of sexual differentiation. But there's a ton going on in there at these stages. And when I hear you talk broadly about, the balance between excitation and inhibition, and some disruption in that, or some alteration in that, setting up a probability of the expression of some behavioral disorder or choice, set of choices. It makes me wonder, about brain function more broadly. Does that somehow make these choices to use a given substance or to do a impulsive behavior? We have to be careful not to project, but is it an attempt to restore some sort of order to that balance? Or is it an expression of an imbalanced system? It's just a seesaw that doesn't tilt all the way to one side or the other.
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. When you talk to people who are, experiencing a substance use disorder, sometimes you hear narratives that are very much in this kind of self-medication frame, right? I took this substance and it made me feel normal, and I didn't feel normal before I had that. But that's not everyone. I mean, addiction is a very heterogeneous disorder. And so I think people's perceptions of their motivations to engage in substance use that's harmful for them, and then how does that relate to the brain mechanism, and then how does that relate to early neurodevelopment? I don't think we know, the specifics of those links to the extent that they exist. Yeah.
my colleague Anna Lemke, who wrote Dopamine Nation, she once said that many addicts, behavioral addictions, I guess they call them process addictions or chemical addictions, that they have this feeling that unless they're experiencing something really intense, like life isn't really happening. Like they crave this intensity of experience. They want peak experience. Either to numb themselves. I mean, it could be a trough experience in the case of sedatives, but that stuck with me. Implied in that is that not everyone is seeking these kind of extreme states. And so layered on what you just described in terms of excitation, inhibition balance, I kind of wonder if people who struggle with addiction are, they're craving getting out of too much inhibition or too much excitation. But this is probably an overly simplistic hypothesis.
So just thinking about that sensation-seeking thing, that driving for intensity, usually when we think of people who are chronically engaging in some behavior despite it having negative consequences for themselves and other people. So this could be drug use, this could be aggression, this could be risky sexual behavior. We can typically think of 3 dimensions of sort of personality and temperament that are often at play. And one of them is this sensation-seeking drive for intensity. So I want it, and I want a lot of it, right? And then one is this disinhibition, failure of self-control. I can't stop myself. And then another, which I think is less well studied, is what people call antagonism or callousness, which is, I know this has negative consequences for other people, but I don't really care. Like that doesn't bother me. And I think what you see is that the combination of factors that goes into any one person's behavior can really vary. So for some people, it's like, this feels great, this feels good, I want the high, I want it to be intense. I'm not disinhibited, I'm deliberately seeking out this behavior. You know, I plan the drugs that I'm going to use for the club the whole week, and I plan my week afterwards. It's not disinhibited at all. It's very purposeful. And then there are people that are like, I wasn't planning, but now I'm at the club and someone offered this to me and I can't stop myself. And then other people are like, I like it, okay, and I could stop myself, but these negative consequences that people keep harping on, you know, the fact that my partner doesn't like this or the police don't like this, like, oh, you know, I'm indifferent, right? And so all of that to say, I think we need to be aware of the complexity and the heterogeneity of different people's motivations when they're doing these behaviors.
Yeah, and these days we hear a lot about the role of trauma in addiction. I mean, I can't do a single post or podcast about addiction and the biology and not hear, well, it's trauma related. But of course, genes come from our parents. We'll talk about that, heritability. And so generational trauma or just childhood trauma doesn't even have to be transgenerational. It can get layered in there in a complicated way.
Yes.
And I'm not trying to say that trauma doesn't play a role. Clearly it does. But it seems that genes could be primary. Trauma in the parents, trauma in the children, traumatizing, you know, hurt people kind of, you know, it's the one cliche that seems to, you know, stand the test of time.
I think it's very hard to say that something is primary or secondary because everything's interacting with everything else. One of the scientific challenges, and then also one of the very human tragedies that we often see, is that the parents who have genetic risks, who are passing those on to their kids, are also the caregivers for those kids. And so the kids who would most benefit from firm, warm, stable, nurturing parenting are also the least likely to get it because the parents themselves are also dealing with their own stuff and they're also leading their own complicated lives. And so it's a tapestry. Like there's a warp and a weft to a piece of cloth. There's the threads that go this way and this way. And I think that's how I think about the relationship between genes and trauma early experience, is that really they both are woven together to build the brain and the body and the personality that then struggles with these behaviors later on in their life.
So if we were to have access to our genomes heading into adolescence or to our kids' genomes, and we know based on your work and the work of others, presumably that some of the genes that predispose to impulsive behavior, addictive behavior, promiscuity, et cetera, that would be useful information, I would think. Right? Then one could think carefully about friend choices, situational choices, install buffers. You know, it sounds so mechanical, but you know, have people around who can help buffer against this these genetic predispositions, which no doubt, as you just said, weave into situational predispositions. Why don't people want that information, or do they want that information? Because I remember in the 80s,